Hi there, welcome to the next in a series of videos looking at Joomla4, and in particular in this video we're going to be looking at dispatcher and factory classes with particular reference to the MVC Factory class. It's in conjunction with looking at how to upgrade to Joomla4 from Joomla3, and we're going to be covering this area here in this page, dispatcher and MVC Factory class. Now, in the last video we were looking at the extension class, and we talked about when Joomla wants to run a component, it will boot that component which will instantiate the extension class, and then it will call the get dispatcher and then dispatch. And here is the line of code within the Joomla core which actually does that. You can see where it is up here in library source component helper.php. It's sitting between obstart and obgetClean because Joomla actually captures the output of this into this contents variable here to output the what is produced by the component later, and it's actually output whenever it creates the HTML file from the template. So the standard template in Joomla site is Cassiopeia, and if we look at the output of the HTML, this will be the page that will be returned by and large, and you can see it's got lots of holes in it where there are JDoc include statements, and if we go down to one of these here, JDoc include type equals component, and this is where the output from the component will be put whenever it's returning the HTML page in response to the HTTP request. So we're going to look at this line here in a bit more detail, and what I've done here is just split it up into its component bits. And you may want to get another view of this by looking at this reference here. I'll put this reference in the notes of the video. So the first thing it does is extension. It boots the component which creates the extension, and we looked and we skimmed over a wee bit, but we looked at the services provider.php file, and where it creates a new hello world component down here whenever it's booted, and then returns that component at the end. That component then, whenever it's created, it's got a ComponentDispatcher factory, and so it's got a link to this ComponentDispatcher factory, and I've shown that link by a blue dashed line here. So this extension instance here is aware of this instance here, and I've just signified that by that blue dashed line. Then when that's returned, the dispatcher equals extension get dispatcher, so it will call the get dispatcher function on this extension, and that get dispatcher function we found was in one of the classes that it inherited from. So sorry, not that one. Our extension inherits from MVC component in Joomla CMS extension. MVC component, which in turn extended component, and here is our call to the dispatcher factory, create dispatcher. And because we've instantiated this extension passing in the dispatcher factory when it's created, it's got this reference to the dispatcher factory at the outset and can call create dispatcher on it. So here's our call to create dispatcher within this ComponentDispatcher factory. So if we look at the ComponentDispatcher factory, which is going to be in here. Here's our create dispatcher. And the create dispatcher sets up the class name here. And if we have our own specific dispatcher, it will use this form. But we don't have one, so it'll drop back to the component dispatcher. And that component dispatcher is in this namespace here, component CMS dispatcher, component dispatcher. And this is the file that has got our dispatch. So the final thing here, when it gets back the dispatcher, it's going to call dispatcher dispatch, and it's going to run this dispatch function within the dispatcher. So that's what we're going to look at in a bit more detail now. If we look at the code, it's doing, well, a bit of check access there, and then it's looking at this controller.task. So it's getting the task parameter from the URL query parameters. And as you're probably aware from Joomla 3, it splits that up into the first part before the dot being the controller, and the second part after the dot being the method. So it's getting this task parameter from the query parameters, and if there's no task parameter set, it will just default to display. And you can follow this code through, but what ends up at the back end of it is the controller variable is set to the first part before the dot, and if there's nothing there, it will just use display. And the second part is set to the bit after the dot, and again, if there's nothing there, it will just revert to display. And then it calls get controller, and it passes the controller name, the first part before the dot, and it also passes this app get name, which will result in either a string of site or administrator passed to this get controller function. So here we have our get controller function. Remember, the parameter, the name of the controller we want, and the client is site or administrator. And here it's calling controller this MVC Factory create controller. So it's calling a create controller function on this variable MVC Factory. Now, where does that MVC Factory come from? Well, we find that MVC Factory is passed in as a parameter when it's constructed. So this component dispatcher, when it's created by the component dispatcher factory here, it's passed in the MVC Factory. And the component dispatcher factory, how does it know about it? Well, in turn, when it is created, when the factory class is created, it gets passed the namespace and the MVC Factory. And to get that, we have to go back to our servicesprovider.php file, and when we're creating this dispatcher factory, we're passing in this namespace here. So anyway, sorry, let me revert there. When we create this component dispatcher factory, we're creating this thing, component dispatcher factory, which is in Joomla CMS extension service provider component dispatcher factory. So let's just look at that. Component extension service provider component dispatcher factory. And this is what will be run, and as part of this, it will create a new Joomla CMS dispatcher component dispatcher factory, and it will pass in the namespace, which is going to be set here, and it's going to be passing in the MVC Factory. And again, I'm glossing over a couple of things here, but when we look at the services.provider.php file, it will hopefully all become clear. But basically what happens is whenever we get this component dispatcher factory, it has got a reference to the MVC factory, and I've shown that here by this blue dashed line. And when it creates the dispatcher, it also has a reference to this MVC factory. So when it wants to get the controller created, it can call create controller, and it has this reference to the factory to call that. So let's look in a bit more detail at our MVC factory. It is going to be in MVC Factory. Here's our MVC Factory. Here's our create controller class. So let's see how that works. Our component dispatcher we have passed into, let's just check, we've passed in our get controller MVC Factory, we've passed in the name, which is the name of the controller. We've passed in the client, which is site or administrator. So when it comes in here, there's the name of the controller and the client. They call the prefix here. So our MVC create controller is going to form this class name by calling this function here. And it's going to pass two variables to it, controller, and then whatever our name is, which for example may be display, so we could get controller backslash display controller, and it's going to pass in the prefix, which remember is site or administrator. Our get class name, if we go down to it, is going to take, there's our name, which is controller backslash display controller or something like that. Here's the prefix, which is site or administrator, and it's going to form the class name from the namespace plus the prefix site or administrator plus the name, which controller backslash display controller. And if you remember back to our hello world, the talk on namespaces, here we've got Robbie component hello world, which is the namespace, administrator, and then for example controller, and then display controller. So whenever we get in our name here, this is the fully qualified name of one of the classes within our hello world tutorial code, and it will call class exists on that class name. And as we talked about in the namespacing video, this will be then sent to the autoloader, which will try and find our class, and it will use the PSR4 recommendations to work out where that class should be on file on the disk, and then it will do a require of that class. And then at that stage, PHP will then know about that class. So it will return that class name back up to create controller. And here it is here, new class name, so it will create an instance of that controller through this. And because we've gone through that process, PHP will now know what that class is and will create an instance of our controller class here. The other thing which is probably worthwhile saying about this, we looked at this get class name, and it was inputting the namespace. So how does the namespace how does it get to know about that? And if you look at this constructor here, it gets passed in the namespace. Now if we go back to our services provider.php file, whenever we're creating our MVC factory, and this is this extension, it's not the same MVC factory. In fact, we'll just look at that here. Extension provider, MVC Factory. Whenever we create this, we create a new MVC Factory. Here's the line here. It will create a new MVC Factory class. This is the class that we want, and it will pass in that namespace that was specified here. So we end up with an MVC Factory class which is constructed using our namespace passed in as a parameter, so that whenever it comes to create the classes for us, it already knows what our namespace should be. So in summary, the component dispatcher dispatch code replaces the hello world PHP file. And if we just look at that, this is our hello world PHP, hello world.php from Joomla 3. And it's got jcontroller legacy, get instance, and hello world. So if we look at jcontroller legacy, now if we go to Joomla 3, which is here, Joomla 3 libraries, class map, and if we look for jcontroller legacy, here it is here. So it's Joomla CMS MVC controller. This is the one we want. So if we go to MVC controller, remember this is the Joomla 3 version here, base controller, and we look for get instance. Here we are here. And it's doing the same sort of things. It's looking at our controller task and it's setting up what it expects to be the controller name, and then at the end of the day it's setting a new class there based on what the controller name should be. Component dispatcher. So that is basically the same as what our dispatcher is doing. It's getting the controller name and then executing the task and redirect. In the same way, in Joomla 3, it's getting the controller, getting an instance of that, and then controller executing the task. So our hello world.php file is no longer necessary. And if you're using the same sort of thing as Joomla expects, as default, then we don't even need to have our own dispatcher class. We just use the Joomla core dispatcher class. But there are some benefits. The controller names are now more consistent. So whereas before in Joomla 3 we had in our hello world we had our controller.php in the top level directory, and then we had controllers directory and hello world and hello worlds.php in the subdirectory. Now we have a nice consistent naming convention with each of our controllers having this sort of form. And if we look into them, display controller, we've got the same class name. If we look at the hello world controller, it's got hello world controller. So all the class names are consistent, the file names are consistent, a lot easier to work with. Just as an aside, in some of the components, for example, I think in content, you have got a controller, sorry, this is the Joomla 3 version. Let's go to our Joomla 4 version. Ajax controller there, So just to highlight the fact, there's nothing special about the Ajax controller. There's no special processing of the XHR bit in the HTTP request. It's just getting set to the Ajax controller based on task being set to ajax.something in the JavaScript code. So we do use JavaScript in the tutorial, and I've just left it going through to the Hello World component rather than setting up a separate Ajax controller. If you want to have a separate Ajax controller, you need to set your task to be ajax.something within your JavaScript. Okay, let's look at a bit more detail about our MVC Factory then. We have our controller, and the standard thing that Joomla does within the controller is it gets the view and it gets the model. So if we go down to look at that, now our controller is going to be the base controller in our library. Base controller here, and if we look for get view, here's our get view function. And where are we? Get view is going to come down, and somewhere it's going to have a create view. That's the one that we want. So it's going to call create view. And here's our create view. So in our controller, if we want to get a view, we're going to call this create view function in the controller, and here it is, it's going to call the factory create view. Now, how does it know about the factory? Well, whenever we created the controller here, we passed it down from the MVC Factory. So if we go back to the MVC Factory, and it's this MVC Factory we want. Whenever we created the controller, created the class name, we passed down this, and this is the instance of the MVC Factory. So whenever the base controller is created and instantiated, it's got in its constructor the second parameter is the factory, right? So it will use that factory in its create view function, and then we'll call create view on the factory. So I've represented that in here, that the controller knows about this MVC Factory. It gets passed that parameter down in its constructor. So then when it comes to create a view, it can call factory create view, and it will call the create view function within the MVC Factory. And that is pretty much the same as the create controller function. You got the same sort of things, the name and the prefix, getting the class name, and this time it's view, and then creating a new object there on the class. Similarly, it's going to get the model and is going to call create model, and the create model is similarly going to create the class or an instance of the class. And I've represented the instantiation by these red lines here. So the MVC Factory instantiates our view, our model, and our table instances. And then within the controller, the standard approach is to set against the view the model, so that whenever we come to the view, we can call get model, but get model doesn't go back to the MVC Factory. In fact, if we look at the create view, whenever it creates the view here, it doesn't pass down the MVC Factory instance. So there's no way that the view can actually get a pointer back to this MVC Factory instance by just following the default. You can obviously sneak it through in this config parameter here, but generally there shouldn't be any necessity for the view to get anything from the factory. It should be able to get past it from the controller. Also, it will create the model, and they'll create the model, and the model then has got a call to get table, which results in factory create table. So again, if we look at the MVC Factory, whenever we're creating the model, and here's the line here, it's passing in, when it creates the model, it's passing this. So the model then will have a pointer back to the MVC Factory. So it can then use it to create the table. So here's a summary. So the MVC Factory is used to create the controller, view, model, and table instances. The factory is instantiated with our namespace. So when it gets requests to create these, it uses that to set up the class which it's expecting to find. But it relies on the calling function to pass the name of the controller or whatever that is required. And that by default is going to be the dispatcher for the controller. So the dispatcher is going to call get controller and call create controller on the MVC Factory. So it needs to pass in the name that it wants. It's going to be the controller for the view and the model. So it's going to be passing whatever view and model it wants here. And it's going to be the model for the table class. And the standard thing would be just to use get view, get model, and get table, passing the name, the prefix, and those two things will then get the right class that we're expecting. Notice that the prefix is different from version 3. So whenever we had a call in version 3, and I think there's in, for example, the Hello World model, wherever it is, get table. So here's our get table call within the Hello World model in version 3, and we're passing in a prefix of Hello World table. So it's different in version 4, so we need to make sure that we change our code within the model and within any of our MVC components, the controller, view, and model, and we use this prefix to designate the site or the administrator. So that's quite important there. The API there has changed in terms of what is expected to get passed as the prefix. And you may be wondering, really, do we need to know all about this? Well, unfortunately we do, because the standard way that we got models and tables and everything was to use get instance. And if we looked at the API on get instance, for example, this is the table class here, we look at get instance and we see it's deprecated. So at some point in version 5, this get instance call is going to disappear and we're going to have to use this MVC Factory. Now that said, there are still a lot of get instance calls in the Joomla4 code, in the Joomla code itself. So for example, if we look at our table here and content table, and we look down get instance, here we have a nice get instance call within our Joomla4 code. What the code is trying to do here, this is when you're creating a content record and you're setting an alias, you want to make sure that that alias is unique, and the way it does that is just by getting another table instance and loading the value of that loading a record from that table with that alias, and if it's already found one, then it will give a problem because there'll be a duplicate index there. So in this way it avoids putting in records with duplicate aliases. But we're down in our table class here. This is table. So we're down basically here, and whenever we create our table, if we look back to our MVC Factory, create table, here's our new, all we're passing down is the database. So there's no way that our table can actually get a pointer back to our MVC Factory to create another table class, to load it, to check that the alias is indeed unique. So there are these things within the Joomla code which really do need to be fixed up before version 5 comes along. And so if you're aware of anything like this where it's changed in later versions of 4, just stick it on the comments on the video, and I'll try and make sure that the notes there and the slides get updated to reflect that. So pretty much at an end here. We've looked through this dispatcher class, we've looked through this MVC class. I should say that if we get a default kind of like URL with no task parameter, just the view set, then by default what you're going to get is the controller, display controller, the view with the view name, the model with the view name, and the table with the view name. So if you need to deviate from anything like that, you need to call get table or get model and just pass in the name that the model or table that you want. Okay, that's about it for now. Thanks for watching. Bye.